Shirley Conan stood at London's Victoria Station on May 10, 1967, and watched the bustle of a city that felt like it was finally shaking off the gray fatigue of the post-war years. For Shirley and her husband, Ray, this was more than just a trip. It was a 5-month odyssey across a continent that was rapidly modernizing, even as it clung to its medieval bones. She spent that morning navigating the red double-decker buses towards Selfridges on Oxford Street. Inside the massive department store, she shopped for treasures she'd eventually carry across borders, pausing for a lunch of roast beef and tea that she noted was very good, a simple sensory anchor before the journey turned truly cinematic. By 4:30 that afternoon, the London streets were in the rearview mirror as their group bus began a long crawl toward the coast. The transition from the solid ground of England to the North Sea was jarring. They boarded a steamer bound for the Hook of Holland, and Shirley's first impression of their cabin was a blunt ah. It was a cramped 7-by-8-foot space on a beat-up boat where the supper was lackluster and the air turned bitter cold. But as the steamer cut through the dark, smooth waters of the North Sea, the discomfort of the cabin faded into the anticipation of the German border. By May 12th, the landscape had shifted into the lush, rolling greenery of the German countryside. The bus hummed along the Autobahn, but the modern world asserted itself in the form of a tricky detour near the border. Shirley watched from her window as the bus sat practically motionless for an hour, caught in a sea of local traffic as Germans headed out for the Whitsunday holiday. When they finally broke free, the spire of the Cologne Cathedral rose up like a stone giant. Shirley walked through the nave of the K No. 246 Elner Dom, a structure that had taken over 6 centuries to complete, its foundations dating back to the 1200s. Standing in that Gothic silence, she felt the weight of those 700 years of labor. It was a most wonderful experience, a sharp contrast to the horror of the hotel room that awaited them later in Koblenz. To escape the silly beds of their accommodation, Shirley, along with fellow travelers Peggy and Greg, sought out the banks of the Rhine. They sat at a sidewalk cafe, the cold condensation on their beer glasses mirroring the mist on the water. The journey along the Rhine River was, in Shirley's eyes, one of the grandest things she had ever seen. Miles and miles of grapevines clung to the steep mountainsides, a terraced emerald ladder rising toward the clouds. The drive continued north toward Frankfurt and Heidelberg, but the real magic happened when they reached the romantic road. At a small rest stop, Shirley sat with a coffee and a sweet, the steam rising in the cool air. A German man sitting at the next table suddenly burst into song, his voice magnificent and clear, filling the room as a pianist played traditional melodies. It was a moment of pure, unscripted connection, the kind that travel guides can't promise. But as they pulled into Rothenburg ob der Tauber on May 13th, Shirley felt as if the bus had actually functioned as a time machine. Rothenburg was a dream preserved in amber. They checked into the Hotel BNW 224, Rennes, and for once, the icky rooms of the previous nights were forgotten. The room was immense, the bathroom the size of a standard hotel room, and the beds were topped with massive feather duvets. On the pillow sat a single coin, a small token of hospitality. Shirley sank into a bubble bath, the first real luxury of the trip, before heading down for a dinner of rich German food and wine. Outside, the town was vibrant, vibrating with the energy of the upcoming Whitsunday festival, known locally as the Meistertrunk or Master Drought. This festival commemorates a legendary event from the 30 Years' War when a former mayor saved the town from destruction by winning a drinking bet with a Swedish general. As Shirley and her group looked for a place to celebrate, a fierce thunderstorm broke over the medieval rooftops. Lightning flashed against the half-timbered walls, and thunder rattled the ancient glass. A 19-year-old hotel employee, whom Shirley described as real suave, offered to lead them through the rain. They huddled under umbrellas, Peggy in a borrowed raincoat, as they dashed through the downpour, trying 3 different wine cellars before they finally found an opening. Inside the candlelit warmth of the cellar, they ordered bottles of local wine. Shirley admitted in her diary the next day that the wine went straight to her head. They eventually crawled upstairs late that night, feeling the effects of the celebration. "Both of us feel terrible in the morning," she wrote from the bus, the memory of the wine still humming in her temples. The morning of May 14th brought a cure in the form of hot rolls, sweet butter, and the strong, dark coffee that Shirley noted was particularly good in Germany. Their guide, Ed, took them on a tour of the town's medieval walls and secret gardens. While they were exploring, a woman appeared on a balcony and struck up a conversation. It was one of those impossible coincidences of the road. The woman, Gloria, was a Canadian who had also lived in Chicago's Old Town. She invited the entire group into her home, which turned out to be a renovated medieval jail. Inside, the stark history of the prison had been transformed into a residence of staggering wealth. Gloria was a multimillionairess, and her private collection was filled with priceless paintings. She casually mentioned to the group that she and her family were the ones who had recently sold a Leonardo da Vinci painting, a story that had been dominating the international newspapers. This was likely the Ginevra da Benci, sold by the Prince of Liechtenstein to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for a record-breaking $5 million that very year. Shirley stood in the middle of a former prison cell, surrounded by masterpieces and modern luxury, listening to this charming woman share the secrets of an art world elite. Even their guide, Ted, was stunned, telling the group he had never experienced anything like it. They left Rothenburg and the romantic road behind, heading toward the Austrian border. The drive took them through the Bavarian Alps, and Shirley saw her first snow-capped mountains, their white peaks jagged against a piercing blue sky. But the transition into Austria was nearly derailed by a moment of panic. As they crossed the border, Shirley, sitting near the front, realized a seat was empty. They had lost Walter. He had somehow been left behind at the border checkpoint. The bus driver had to perform a precarious maneuver, backing the massive vehicle down the highway to retrieve their stranded companion. Walter was found with an awful fright, but safely back on board. The group continued their climb into the Alps. They arrived in Salzburg around 6 in the evening, greeted by another hearty meal and red wine. This time, the hotel room was absolutely lovely, a peaceful end to a day that had spanned centuries of history and thousands of miles of landscape. Shirley took a short walk through the Baroque streets of Salzburg, listening to the distant sound of the river, before returning to her room to do laundry and finally turn in early. The whirlwind of London shops, Rhine vineyards, and Rothenburg wine cellars was finally settling into the permanent ink of her journal. Recommend this journey to a friend who appreciates a story where the past is never truly behind us.